It's so fascinating to me how much we talk about fluency, but then how little we actually understand the mental processes behind it.
Welcome to Fluent by Nature, the podcast where we dive into language learning from a psycholinguistic perspective. My name is Till Poppels, and ever since getting my PhD in linguistics a few years back, I've been working on bridging the gap between psycholinguistic research and the way we approach language learning. And so Fluent by Nature is for language learners and educators who want to know a little bit more about the cognitive machinery behind linguistic communication. Each episode revolves around an article that I've written, but instead of simply reading the articles, I turned them into AI-generated conversations to make it more fun and more easily digestible. Today's deep dive is on an article that I wrote recently called 5 Reasons Why You Are Still Not Fluent.
Welcome to the very first episode of Fluent by Nature. On this show, we like to do a deep dive into all things language learning. And today we are tackling something that's probably on all of your minds, fluency. It's something we all want. But how many of us have actually sat down and thought about what fluency means from a scientific perspective? We're going to go beyond some of those common myths that you might have heard to give you a clear psycholinguistic understanding of how fluency works.
Yeah, and I think this is something a lot of our listeners can relate to. I mean, becoming fluent in another language can be a real challenge, right?
Absolutely, and it's something that so many people want to achieve, but it can be frustrating when you feel like you're not making progress.
Exactly. So we're hoping that this deep dive will help uncover some of those hidden obstacles to fluency and maybe provide some new insights from the world of psycholinguistics.
Yeah, because this article goes beyond just the typical surface level advice. Like it really digs into the cognitive processes behind language learning, which I think is really fascinating.
Okay, so let's jump right in. The first point the article makes is about vocabulary. I mean, we all know that having a good vocabulary is important, but the article argues that there's actually more to it than just memorizing a bunch of words.
Right. It's not just about quantity, it's about quality too.
Exactly. Like they have this really interesting example in German where they talk about how to express admiration for someone's dedication. And you could just say, good job or something like that. But in German, there are all these nuanced words that can convey a much deeper meaning. And the article argues that using these more precise words can make your language sound much more sophisticated and native-like.
It's kind of like choosing the right spices for a dish.
Yeah.
You wouldn't just use salt and pepper for everything. You want to find those unique flavors that will really make the dish sing.
That's a great analogy. I love that. So it's not just about having a big vocabulary. It's about having the right words for the right situation. And speaking of having the right words, the article brings up this concept of lexical access, which, to be honest, I wasn't really familiar with before.
Yeah, it's not a term you hear every day.
So can you explain what lexical access is and why it's so important for fluency?
Sure. So lexical access is basically how quickly and easily your brain can retrieve a word from your mental lexicon.
Our mental lexicon.
Yeah, that's basically your brain's dictionary.
Yeah.
All the words you know are stored in there.
Okay.
And so when you need to use a word in a conversation, your brain has to search through that lexicon and find it.
Okay.
And the faster and more efficiently you can do that, the more fluent you'll sound.
I see.
Because if you're constantly having to pause and search for words, it's going to disrupt the flow of your speech.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So it's not enough to just know a lot of words. You have to be able to access them quickly and effortlessly.
Exactly. It's like having a huge library full of books. But if you can't find the book you're looking for, it's not going to do you much good.
It's true. We've all had that experience, haven't we? Like when you know the word you want to say, but you just can't seem to remember it.
Oh, absolutely. It's that tip of the tongue phenomenon. And that's a perfect example of poor lexical access in action.
So I guess the question is, how do we improve our lexical access?
Well, that leads us perfectly to the next point in the article, which is all about the importance of context.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So the article talks about this thing called the wallpaper effect.
The wallpaper effect, what's that?
Well, it's this idea that we're more likely to remember information if we learn it in the same environment where we'll need to use it.
I see.
Like if you learn a French phrase while watching a scene on Netflix where someone is expressing empathy, you're more likely to remember that phrase when you find yourself in a similar situation in real life.
Oh, because the context will trigger your memory.
Exactly. It's like the emotional cues and the visual imagery from that scene on Netflix, they all become associated with that phrase in your mind.
So it's not just about memorizing words in isolation. It's about connecting them to real-world experiences.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. So you're saying that the way we learn new vocabulary can actually affect how well we can access it later on.
Exactly. And that's why the article is so critical of traditional rote memorization methods.
Like flashcards and vocabulary lists.
Exactly. Because those methods often lack the richness and depth of real-world context.
Right. They're just isolated words with no connection to anything meaningful.
Exactly. And that makes them much harder to remember and retrieve when you need them.
Okay, so I'm starting to see the importance of this wallpaper effect.
Yeah.
But how can we actually apply it to our language learning?
Well, it's all about finding ways to immerse yourself in the language as much as possible.
Okay.
Like watching movies and TV shows in your target language.
Right.
Listening to music, reading books, having conversations with native speakers.
So basically surrounding yourself with the language as much as possible.
Exactly. The more you can create those wallpaper situations, the more likely you are to remember the words and phrases you learn.
Okay, I like it. So instead of just drilling vocabulary lists, we should be looking for ways to weave those words into our daily lives.
Exactly.
This is making me rethink my whole approach to language learning.
That's great to hear.
Yeah.
And I think you'll be amazed at how much of a difference it makes.
Okay, so we've talked about vocabulary and lexical access. What's next on our fluency checklist?
Well, the next hurdle is one that a lot of learners struggle with, and that's grammar.
Grammar. I thought we were going to avoid that.
I know a lot of people think grammar is boring, but this article makes a really compelling argument for why it's actually super important.
Really? Convince me.
Okay, so the article points out that even subtle differences in grammar can drastically change the meaning of a sentence. And they use this perfect example of the Spanish subjunctive, which I know can be a bit intimidating for learners.
Oh, yes, the dreaded subjunctive. I've heard stories.
But it's actually not as scary as it seems. And once you understand how it works, it can actually be a really powerful tool for expressing yourself.
Okay, so how does it work?
Well, the subjunctive mood is used to express things that are uncertain, hypothetical, or subjective.
Okay.
Like doubts, wishes, or possibilities. And in Spanish, there are specific verb conjugations that you use for the subjunctive mood, which are different from the conjugations you use for the indicative mood.
The indicative mood being for things that are certain and factual.
Exactly. And the article explains how just changing the mood of a verb can completely change the meaning of a sentence.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure. So let's say you want to say, I think it's important to study.
Okay.
In Spanish, you would say, creo que es importante estudiar.
Okay.
But if you wanted to say, I think it's important that you study, you would use the subjunctive mood. And that's why grammar is so important, because it allows you to convey these subtle nuances of meaning that you wouldn't be able to express otherwise.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about memorizing a bunch of rules, it's about understanding how those rules shape the way we communicate.
Exactly. And the article goes on to explain how these grammatical distinctions don't always map perfectly from one language to another.
Right, because different languages have different ways of expressing things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can be really tricky for learners, because it means you can't just rely on direct translations.
Right. You have to really understand the underlying logic of the language.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how grammar can actually be a superpower, but I still think a lot of learners find it intimidating.
I understand that. But the good news is that, just like with vocabulary, context can make learning grammar a lot easier.
Really? How so?
Well, when you encounter grammar in action within real-world conversations and stories, it becomes much more intuitive.
So it's not just about memorizing a rule in a textbook.
No, it's about seeing how that rule is actually used in practice.
Okay, I like that. So it's kind of like learning to swim. You can read all the books about stroke technique, but until you get in the water and feel the resistance, it's just theory.
Exactly. That's a perfect analogy. And that's where real fluency lies, wouldn't you say?
Totally agree. Okay, we've covered vocabulary, lexical access, and now grammar. It's amazing how all these pieces fit together. What's next on our fluency puzzle?
Well, the next obstacle the article tackles is something I'm sure we've all experienced at some point. The dreaded translation trap.
Ooh, that sounds ominous. What exactly is the translation trap?
It's that tendency we have, especially when we're first learning a language, to constantly translate everything in our heads.
Oh, yeah, I'm definitely guilty of that. It's like my brain turns into this slow, clunky translator.
Exactly. And the article gives this great example of someone in a Madrid cafe trying to order something in Spanish. And they're so focused on mentally translating every single word that by the time they manage to string together a sentence, the moment has passed and the conversation feels awkward.
Ugh, I hate when that happens. It's like you're trying to run a race with a dictionary strapped to your back.
Exactly. You're so bogged down in the mechanics of translation that you lose the spontaneity and flow of natural conversation.
Right. And I bet it makes it hard to actually connect with people, too.
Absolutely, because you're not really present in the moment. You're too busy trying to figure out the right words.
So how do we break free from this translation trap?
Well, the article argues that the key is to start thinking directly in the target language.
But how do you even do that?
It takes practice, but the more you immerse yourself in the language, the more you'll start to internalize its patterns and structures.
So it's about developing that intuitive sense of the language.
Exactly. And the article highlights something really interesting, which is that even native bilinguals can struggle with direct translation sometimes.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought they would be pros at it.
Well, they're obviously fluent in both languages, but they don't necessarily think in terms of one-to-one word mappings.
So it's not just about knowing the equivalent words in each language.
No, it's about understanding how those words function within the unique grammar and syntax of each language.
Okay, so it's about seeing the language as a whole, not just a collection of individual words.
Exactly. And that's why relying too heavily on translation can actually hinder our progress toward fluency.
Because it keeps us tethered to our native language.
Exactly, instead of allowing us to fully immerse ourselves in the target language.
It's kind of like trying to appreciate a painting by analyzing each brushstroke individually, instead of just taking in the whole masterpiece.
I love that analogy because it really captures the essence of what we're talking about. Fluency is about seeing the big picture, not getting bogged down in the details.
So how do we train our brains to think directly in the target language?
Well, the article recommends a few different techniques. One is to practice speaking in highly engaging and immersive contexts, like having conversations with native speakers, or watching movies and TV shows with subtitles.
So basically surrounding yourself with the language as much as possible.
Exactly. And another technique the article suggests is to pause a TV show or movie and try to come up with responses as if you were one of the characters.
Oh, that's a fun idea. It's like giving your brain a mini immersion workout.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it forces you to think on your feet and use the language creatively.
I like it. I'm definitely going to try that. Okay, so we've tackled vocabulary, grammar, and the translation trap. What's the final obstacle standing between us and fluency?
Well, I think it's something that a lot of learners struggle with, and that's the fear of making mistakes.
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one. I know, I'm always so worried about saying something wrong and sounding stupid.
It's totally natural to feel that way.
Yeah.
But the article reminds us that making mistakes is actually an essential part of the learning process.
Really?
Absolutely. Because every time you make a mistake, it's an opportunity to learn and improve.
I guess that makes sense.
And the article actually compares two different types of learners. One who's learned through immersion, and another who's focused on memorizing rules.
Okay.
And they found that the immersive learner is much less afraid of making mistakes because they see them as a natural part of the journey.
That makes sense, because they're not so focused on being perfect.
Exactly. They're more interested in communicating and connecting with people.
And I bet that makes them more confident, too.
Absolutely, because they're not constantly second-guessing themselves.
So how do we become more like the immersive learner? How do we overcome that fear of making mistakes?
Well, the article suggests that one way is to focus on contextual learning.
Okay.
Because when you're immersed in the language, you're not so worried about getting every grammatical detail, right?
You're more focused on the meaning of what you're saying.
Exactly. And that allows you to relax and just enjoy the process of learning.
So it's about shifting our focus from accuracy to fluency.
Exactly. And remembering that mistakes are not the enemy. They're actually our friends.
Because they help us grow and learn.
Exactly. So the next time you make a mistake in your target language, don't beat yourself up about it.
Correct.
Just embrace it as a learning opportunity and keep on practicing.
That's great advice. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from vocabulary and grammar to the translation trap and the fear of making mistakes.
It's been quite a journey, but I think we've managed to unpack some of the key obstacles to fluency, and more importantly, how to overcome them.
So what's the big takeaway here? What do we hope our listeners will remember from this deep dive?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that fluency is about so much more than just knowing a lot of words and grammar rules.
Right. It's about being able to use the language naturally and effortlessly.
Exactly. Like without having to think too much about it.
Exactly. It's about being able to express yourself authentically, just like you do in your native language.
And the article actually ends with a series of questions that learners can ask themselves to kind of assess their progress and identify areas for improvement.
Oh, that's interesting. What kind of questions? Well, the first one is all about contextual learning. It asks, do you mainly learn through authentic content and real-life scenarios, or are you stuck in rote memorization mode?
That's a good question, because it really forces you to think about how you're approaching language learning.
Right, like are you just passively memorizing words and rules, or are you actively engaging with the language in a way that makes it come alive?
And the second question is about vocabulary depth.
Okay.
It asks, am I exposed to a wide range of vocabulary in my target language, including words that express nuance and emotion?
So it's not just about knowing the basic words, it's about having a rich and varied vocabulary.
Exactly. And the article even suggests a helpful rule of thumb.
What's that?
It says that you should aim to expose yourself to the kinds of conversations with the desired level of detail and expressiveness that you want to be having yourself.
That makes sense. So if you dream of discussing complex topics or debating current events in your target language, you need to be reading, watching, and listening to material that uses that level of vocabulary.
Precisely. And the third question tackles grammatical fluidity. It asks, am I comfortable experimenting with different grammatical constructions, or am I sticking to the basics?
Right, because just knowing the basic grammar rules isn't enough for fluency.
Exactly. You need to be able to use those rules creatively and flexibly. And that comes from seeing how native speakers use grammar in real-life situations.
So it's about going beyond those textbook examples and experiencing grammar in action.
Exactly. And the article emphasizes that to really internalize the rules, you need to be exposed to authentic content at your target level of grammatical sophistication.
Okay.
You need to see and hear those complex sentences being used naturally.
So if you want to sound like a native speaker, you need to surround yourself with native level content.
Exactly. Now, what about the translation trap? Does the article offer any advice for breaking free from that mental back and forth?
It does. Question number 4 asks, do you find yourself constantly translating in your head, or are you starting to think directly in your target language?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, and it's something that I think a lot of learners struggle with.
Well, the article advocates for training your brain to skip that translation step.
Okay.
And one way to do this is by practicing speaking in highly engaging and immersive contexts.
Like what?
Well, the article actually suggests a really fun technique, which is to pause a TV show or movie in your target language and imagine you're one of the characters.
Oh, I love that idea. It forces you to think on your feet and use language creatively.
Exactly. And finally, the fifth question brings us back to the importance of embracing imperfection.
Okay.
It asks, do you focus on expressing yourself even if you make mistakes along the way?
Right, because fluency is not about perfection.
It's about connection.
It's about using the language to communicate and build relationships.
Exactly. And the article concludes by saying that if you're actively addressing these areas and constantly challenging yourself to step outside your comfort zone, you're well on your way to unlocking your full linguistic potential.
That's encouraging. It means that fluency is within reach as long as we have the right mindset and strategies.
And what's even more exciting is that this article is actually part of a series. And the author mentioned that a lot of people requested a follow-up specifically on contextual learning techniques.
Oh, wow. So there's even more to explore.
There is. And we'd love to hear from you, our listeners. Would you be interested in learning more about practical strategies for contextual learning in a future deep dive? Let us know.
But for now, we hope this deep dive has given you a fresh perspective on the path to fluency. And we look forward to exploring more fascinating language learning topics with you in future episodes of Fluent by Nature. Until next time, happy language learning.